Hello and welcome to Gardener's World. Today we've got a really special show. We've got the expert Tim Wallace-Murphy on with us, the expert in Templars, in what's known as the Rex Deus, which we're going to get into soon, in the Holy Grail, in Freemasonry, symbolism, all manner of things. And people will know of Tim's work through the best-selling book that he had out with Marilyn Hopkins, Roslyn. It was a superb book, it really is. A read that everybody's got to get through, not least of which was a man known as Dan Brown, who used this for his book, The Da Vinci Code, which I'm sure really did the book sales pretty, a lot of good. One of his latest books is The Knights of the Holy Grail, which he's just given me, so I'm looking forward to reading this. I'm sure it's a fascinating read, it's a lovely cover, but this, again, goes into the Templars, so this is going to be fascinating. And, of course, another one of his latest books, it just doesn't stop writing, it makes me mad, is The Freemasons. This is really going to be interesting too, because I know that Tim knows an awful lot about the Freemasons from outside and inside, so this is good stuff. Tim, thank you very much for coming along.
It's a pleasure to be here again.
And putting me in the humble situation of having this greatness arriving in my chat show. I'm absolutely fascinated by one of your books, Rex Deus. This is a Latin title. Can we explain to people what this really means? Well,
with pleasure, but before I do, I've got to refute one horrible accusation you've levelled at me of being an expert. X is usually the mark of somebody who is illiterate, and a spurt is an intermittent drip. So if you're accusing me of being an illiterate intermittent drip, I'll cop a plea of guilty. The term expert in its common usage is one I detest. I'm a geriatric student. Okay. I've been following a particular path for over 37 years, and I'm fascinated by what I do. But I wouldn't claim expertise in the common sense. I know a little, I know enough to know where to look next. And that's all I need. Now, you mentioned Rex Deus. Many years ago, I was giving a talk about Roslyn Chapel to a group of people in London. And afterwards, I was approached by somebody who claimed to be a direct descendant of Hugh de Payens, one of the co-founders of the Knights Templar. And also, he said he was a descendant of the original high priesthood of the temple in Jerusalem. I was fascinated by this idea, and I invited the man to dinner, along with another colleague of mine who had a working knowledge of European and biblical history, and we put this man to the question for 5.5 hours and tape recorded the entire thing. And then I spent some 6 or 7 years investigating, was there any validity to the story I'd been given. Now, the story was very simple, that during the time of the Greek kings in Israel, the temple had been defiled, and the original 24 high priestly families, who are known as the Mamadot, had moved from Jerusalem and left the temple because of it being defiled, and had set up shop at a place called Qumran, and these people later became known to history as the Essenes. And two things I already knew about the Essenes. One was that John the Baptist was most certainly an Essene, and secondly, that Jesus, the man that is known to history as Jesus of Nazareth, in fact should be more commonly called Jesus the Nazarene. And the Nazarenes were an offshoot of the Essenes. Nazareth, as such, didn't actually exist at the time of Jesus. So that's one of the many confections brought out by the church. Now, my informant, Michael, who'd collared me after this meeting in London, had given me an indication that the descendants of these 24 priestly families later became known in European history as Rex Deus, but they were very, very secretive. They continued to marry in the traditional Cohenite manner of the Jews of biblical Israel. In other words, they only married other Cohens. They only married people from the same group. And this became one of the keys in discovering who was who within these dynasties. And my colleague and a co-author at that time, Marilyn Hopkins, and myself set out to test to destruction the idea that such a family dynasty could have continued and could have risen to power. As a result of many years of work, we discovered that not only was there some substantial reality behind this theory, but that some common form of belief had united these families to risk their lives, their properties, and their liberty, not once, but many times throughout European history, and that their most famous fruits by which they are known, although the origin of the Rex Deus theory wasn't known at the time, were in movements and initiatives that they started. Those movements include the foundation of the Knights Templar, the writing and propagation of the Grail sagas by Chrétien de Troyes and later by Wolfram von Essenbach.
They were very Cistercian linked.
Yes and no. I'll explain that in a little moment. They were also instrumental in propagating the first set of tarot cards, and the earliest complete set we have got are the Visconti set. There is another set in France called the Grigonneur, which again was promulgated by members of the Rex Deus dynasties. And the tarot cards, although they're used for all sorts of fortune telling, and perhaps quite validly so, who am I to comment, they were also used as playing cards, but they're actually flashcards. They're teaching boards, teaching heresy, a totally different form of belief system to the one promulgated by the church.
Makes a lot of sense.
And then later, the same families were also instrumental in founding another controversial order called the Freemasons. Now, you drop the word Freemasonry into any conversation today and stand by for fireworks. The conversation will reveal the prejudices of those around you, and depending on their religious perspective, they will be either pro or anti-Freemasonry, and it will be alleged by many that there is a worldwide conspiracy between the Jews and the Freemasons to run the world. And all I can say is, if that's the case, being both a Jew and a Freemason, how come I'm not Pope or head of state? I'm not even rich. Again, rather like the Templars, because very little factually is known outside the fraternity, it leaves room for speculation and accusation, which is spread like wildfire.
So in your books, you've actually uncovered evidence to prove that these families do have existed or have... I've got a golden thread through time.
First of all, we found that the whole principle of a hereditary priesthood did not actually start in Israel. It started much earlier in ancient Egypt. And in one program you recorded with that wonderful colleague of mine, Dr. Robert Feather, he mentioned the name Akhenaten. And Akhenaten was an Egyptian pharaoh who was deposed for nearly wrecking the Egyptian economy, oddly, for religious reasons. He instituted a form of monotheism. And Akhenaten, under another name, is actually far more widely known, and that other name is Moses. And if one wants to check on the validity of that particular insight, I would recommend the work by my colleague Ahmed Osman, Moses, Pharaoh of Egypt. The argument as to whether Moses was a pharaoh or an Israelite foundling has long since been settled by Egyptologists. They know he was a pharaoh, and the only argument is to which pharaoh was he. And my money is on Osman's choice to Akhenaten.
So Aaron would have been one of Akhenaten's brothers?
Brothers, yes. And the principle of hereditary priesthood was already well established in Egypt and just simply carried on. There wasn't a people of Israel known as the Israelites or the Hebrews at that time. And don't take my word for that. Check the words of Sigmund Freud, that great Jewish historian. He reckons that the word Hebrew didn't come into common usage until after the exile in Babylon in about 650 BC. So the idea that the Israelites were a separate nation who were enslaved in Egypt is regarded by most historians as spurious nonsense. They were Egyptians who were displaced to what had been an Egyptian colony or satrap state called Canaan. There was no forcible occupation. And from that developed what we now know as the people of Israel. and the religion of early Judaism. And early Judaism didn't start to take on anything remotely like its present form until after the exile in Babylon. And it was after that period that the 24 high priestly families started to attain major importance. And we were able to trace from our research through tax records in Rome of the Roman Empire period the whereabouts of many of these families after the Jewish revolt finished in AD 70 until the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. Now then there becomes a hell of a gap from the time of the fall of the Roman Empire until the development of efficient bureaucracies in France, northern Italy, and Spain, where you're looking at sort of the beginning of the 11th century. There are no independent ways of verifying family tradition. So hand on heart, it is not possible to prove the validity of this theory that they were descended from the priesthood of the Temple of Jerusalem.
Unless there's some kind of genetic way through the DNA.
The DNA tests can prove the probability that it could be true, but again, it cannot prove an absolute fact. It can show a common ancestry at the right period. And there are, among certain of the families, those tests are going on as we speak, certainly amongst the Sinclairs, who are part of that group.
Is that right? Fascinating.
The conclusion that Marilyn and I came to in our first book on Rex Stairs was that it is absolutely impossible of independent verification that this theory is true. But what was possible to verify was the Cohenite pattern of intermarriage between the families, the fact that these families, who often squabbled amongst themselves, would from time to time unite for seemingly implausible reasons and risk their lives, their property, and their freedom for common political ends. So they obviously had some form of common belief system driving them. And we suspect that that common belief system was the Rex Deus theory. Now, according to our informant, the Rex Deus families would outwardly practice the religion, the prevailing religion of their place and time, which in most cases would be Europe and Christianity, but inwardly continue with their own sacred belief system, which were very largely Gnostic, a form of Gnostic Judaism. And it's perhaps instructive that after Rex Deus was published, we received a letter on very impressive headed notepaper saying, "Dear authors, it's a pity you didn't consult me before you rushed so precipitately into print. We must talk, or better yet, meet." So I rang the author of this letter in some trepidation, because we had an incomplete story. We filled in the gaps from our own knowledge of medieval history. And after some chat and sort of getting to know each other a little, I said to him, "Well, excuse me, sir, where did we go wrong?" And his answer was quite revealing. He said, "Oh, you didn't. It's just incomplete. The story's just incomplete. Do you want the rest?" Of course I wanted the bloody rest. And the result of that investigation that started when he started to disclose further information to me, and when I checked on its validity, was a book called Custodians of Truth, which traces a continuous stream of Gnostic initiatory teaching from the times of ancient Egypt right up to and including the present day. It's still happening. And to me, that is what it's all about. And there are certain common themes running through this, which again, I think Dr. Feather has mentioned. That for the Freemasons, for the Knights Templar who preceded them, and for many of the hidden streams of heretical spirituality in medieval Europe, the important issues were not Jesus, the person of Jesus. It was the actual teaching, the process, whereby John the Baptist taught Jesus, who in turn taught John the Divine. So the two Johns...
We're going to have to get on that point there. You're going to have to join us again after the break, when we're going to get deeper into the teachings. What is it that they were really after? What were they really teaching and passing on to each other? Join us after the break. More from Tim Wallace Murphy. and welcome back to Gardener's World. Today we've got Tim Wallace Murphy with us, I won't call him an expert, but the geriatric old man who looks into various mysteries. So before the break we were talking about John the Baptist, and particularly fascinated by the head of John the Baptist, which is really interesting concept when we're talking about the Templars. But you were talking about John the Baptist beforehand, so do continue, please.
Well, to refer back to my good friend and colleague Robert Feather, Robert has uncovered, I think, fairly compelling evidence that John the Baptist's grave is at or near Qumran. And of course the corpse in the grave is headless. We all know the story about Salome and the beheading of John the Baptist. What a lot of people are not aware about is that there are at least 3 claimants to hold the head of John the Baptist. There is a relatively modern reliquary which was created after the French Revolution when the original one was destroyed. And this reliquary contains the alleged head of John the Baptist in Amiens Cathedral in Picardy in France. And Amiens Cathedral had burnt down in a fire at the end of the 12th century, and at the very beginning of the 13th century was rebuilt to house the most precious relic of the Knights Templar, namely the reliquary containing the head of John the Baptist, which had been brought back from Constantinople after the siege of Constantinople by a gentleman called Jean de Sartor. And that reliquary and the head are still to be seen to this day in the ambulatory surrounding the choir at Amiens Cathedral. And according to my good friend and colleague Guy Jourdain, that head was consulted by means of necromancy by the Knights Templar. Now, you believe that or not, according to your own personal predisposition. There is another alleged head of John the Baptist hidden somewhere in Scotland in the keeping of some unnamed but supposedly great and good family, about which, as I've never seen it, and I don't know who's supposed to be its custodians, I haven't the faintest idea. Then we have the famous painting at Templecombe, which was discovered built into a ceiling in what had been an old Templar cottage in the Templar village of Templecombe. And this painting now resides in the church at Templecombe, and the church at Templecombe, of course, is not Templar at all. It's considerably later, but the painting is still there. And careful examination of that painting, which, depending on one's perspective, is either allegedly the head of Jesus or the head of John the Baptist. But if you look at it very, very carefully, you'll find that it is utterly bloodless, white, and is totally detached from any body. And it looks as though it's been violently hacked off somebody. But more importantly, in the background to that painting are distinct markings of the fleur-de-lis, which have been part of the Rex Deus symbolism since the time before Akhenaten, since the time of Thutmose IV in Egypt. The fleur-de-lis has been a sign of the descending bloodline from the Pharaonic house, then later through the royal house of David in Israel, and on to the Capetian kings in France. It's now wrongly regarded as part of the French coat of arms, but in fact it has a highly specific meaning of descent, and it's Gnostic in the extreme. Its origins in Egypt were because the lily was cultivated for its mood-altering qualities and was purely and solely the property of the Pharaonic royal house because it was incredibly difficult to cultivate in that climate. And its first symbolic reference is on a freestanding pillar outside the temple of Karnak that was erected by Thutmose IV. Previous pharaohs had erected, as was traditional, a pair of obelisks flanking the pathway to the temple. Thutmose IV broke with this and put up freestanding pillars of no architectural significance whatsoever, one of which is on the capital is carved a very stylized fleur-de-lis. And those 2 pillars, incidentally, may be the reality that lies behind the story of the pillars of Boaz and Joachim in Solomon's temple, so fondly preserved by the Brotherhood of Freemasonry. because despite the fact that Israel is the most heavily excavated country in the world, no undisputed Solomonic remains of any description have ever been found anywhere within it. So the so-called Second Temple, erected by Zerubbabel, may well have been the first one to be actually sited in Jerusalem. The argument then becomes a historical one. Was the idea of Solomon's temple as described in the Bible founded on a reality in some other country, or was it merely a mythical construct, a nice ideal to which we should aim? And nobody has been able to settle that argument with any great sort of degree of clarity. But it is interesting that one of the people who had a founding touch in the creation of the Order of Freemasons, Earl William Sinclair, who built Rosslyn Chapel, has left us in a church which is regarded as the core church of the worldwide Freemasonry, which celebrates Solomon's temple. The only direct reference to the temple in Jerusalem is oddly to the Second Temple, to Zerubbabel's temple. So one thinks perhaps that the family traditions within Rex Deus had told him something that modern archaeology only discovered very recently. And this family tradition within the Rex Deus families is vitally important, because that's how the Templars knew where to dig to find whatever it was they were looking for.
Right, yeah.
Now, the Copper Scroll was originally decoded by a wonderful man called John Allegro, who later fell out of favour with the academic world, big time. But John had access to many of the sites described in the Copper Scroll and excavated several of them, and none of them did he find any temple treasure. But in a couple, he found Templar artifacts. In other words, somebody had been there before him.
Right.
So the theory that amongst the things discovered under the Temple Mount may have been copies of the scrolls is plausible. It ain't proven, but it's plausible. There is some merit to it. But your guess is as good as mine on that. I mean, this story is endless, and it goes in so many different directions.
But getting back to things we do know, you've just been talking about the head of John the Baptist. We do know from the Bible that that supposedly occurred. We certainly know that the Templars held John in high esteem, amongst other orders as well, it has to be said. The Knights of St. John, for instance. And so why? Why is it so important to worship a head, and why John?
I don't think they were worshipping it in the sense of believing it was divine.
No.
I think they revered it, which is a different thing.
Okay.
Because what they were celebrating was not an individual. They were against that. They'd seen what could happen with the veneration of an individual taken to absurd lengths through the church and the deification of Jesus, which of course is specious and nonsense from start to finish. What they were venerating was a process of transmission of sacred teaching. It's called initiation. It was an inherent part of the Egyptian tradition. It is a part of the tradition of most of the native peoples of this world. It was celebrated in Persia, and it's celebrated again within Freemasonry and within most of the mystical orders in the world. This is the
thing that Islam and our Sufi brethren term the baraka.
That's right. It's the passing on of sacred knowledge and sacred practices leading to sacred knowledge from master to pupil down through the ages by using a form of ritual and stylized teaching, so that the teaching is passed on in exact replication from one generation to another.
Well, there's something about this that is very Egyptian, isn't it?
Yes.
Because, an Egyptian hieroglyph is this depth to it. It doesn't just mean what it says straight to you. There are many reasons to it, and according to some Egyptian Egyptologists I've spoken to, they even almost think that the Egyptians were having a laugh sometimes when they placed a lot of hidden symbolism behind things. But the point being that what they were doing was passing on much more information in a different way to just ordinary words.
Well, it had to be in a different way, because there are so many things. Once you get involved in the mystical path, irrespective of your point of entry, very soon you come to issues which are incapable of being transmitted in words. This is why when I wrote Cracking the Symbol Code, I made a plea to my readers: don't take my word for the explanations of symbols, because symbols are not there to be explained. They're actually there to be... I only explain them to intrigue you, the reader, so you will go and experience them for yourself.
Absolutely.
And your experience of one particular symbol in one site will be very different from mine.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the same place 6 months or a year later, the second or the third time it will be different yet again. It has a means of communication which is totally transcendental.
And kind of unlocks your mind, doesn't it? It's
more than mind.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
Spirit,
it depends what you want to call mind. But,
yeah.
But you want to getting back to what it is that it was unlocking, and we get back again to this word, mystical. Can we explain to people what it really means? Because it's a word that people use, you know, in the pop world. I mean, you know, mystic pop.
Of course they use it in the pop world.
What does it really mean?
Of course they use it
in relation
the pop
to what we're talking about.
Pop is, in many cases, ephemeral dross, which passes, but it's also a vehicle for modern-day poetry and communication.
Yes.
And the principal purpose of a poet is to keep the sense of the mystical alive and well and transmittable and meaningful to people of new generations and new cultures. And that is what part of the pop world does.
Kind of troubadour style.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly that. I've been talking to somebody over the last few days on areas touching on this, and the amount of times that I, as a professional wordsmith, cannot find words to frame an idea or a concept. And I don't have to. In many cases, I can think it and it will be picked up by my partner. It is beyond thought. It is beyond words. But there is a purpose to it. In the Sufi tradition, which you have mentioned so many times with such great respect, they say, go home and polish your hearts. Free it of impurities, free it of malice, free it of envy, so that you can reflect love.
Yes, absolutely.
Unconditional love. It is the answer to being loved. It is the answer to being attacked. You reflect love. It's about service. A very good friend of mine called Eleanor Viva was doing a PhD thesis on the effects of pilgrimage, the transformative effects of pilgrimage, and she was doing this at a time when, by her own admission, she was an agnostic. She didn't know what to believe or whether to believe. And at one stage she met a limping pilgrim, and she said, are you on the pilgrimage to Santiago? And he said, no, I'm on a much older pilgrimage that used the same route, the pilgrimage to the stars. And she had a moment of insight and realized that beneath every valid spiritual path, there is truly only the one.
Yeah.
And then many years later, she realized the real profundity of what she said when she became a Sufi, and the one is defined as the indivisible, Almighty God. That is behind the whole thing, and that is within each one of us. And it is uncovering our ability to communicate with the divine within ourselves and to serve other people with love. That is the essence of the mystical experience.
You're a heretic.
Yes, I am a heretic. Depending on how much time you get, I could waffle on about spirituality in ways that will both appall and amuse you.
The kind of point I'm making is, you know, we talk about the Templars and their possible knowledge of gnosis and the mystical experience, you know, the knowledge that comes from the mystical experience. Their connection to Islam, to me, is fascinating, because having read in depth, you know, Islamic works, I see a lot of gnosis in there, in Islamic works, which we fail to see today because of the junk that we're thrown at on the TV most of the time. Do you see the same thing?
Yes, but there was Gnosticism, although it was abjured as a heresy, it ran like a river underground throughout European history, particularly in the medieval period. Let's clear away one fallacy. The Templars were not the only Gnostics in the business.
No.
Most of the people we now call the medieval mystics, people like Hildegard von Bingen, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Meister Eckhart, our own Julian of Norwich, were all Gnostics and suffered very serious abuse from the church.
And then reclaimed by the Catholic Church.
And then later reclaimed when they were safely dead. It's rather like Thomas Aquinas, I mean, the great Thomist philosopher. He's revered as a saint, yet he was condemned for heresy. And he became speechless as a psychological result of that.
Has time changed?
Yes, not really. The Church has not changed much. I mean, the present Pope, Pope Benedict, the umpteenth, or whatever his title is He used to be known as God's Rottweiler. He excommunicated, when he was head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, better yet known as the Inquisition, he excommunicated more theologians in 20-odd years than his predecessors had done in 3 centuries. What's changed?
No, not a lot.
Not a lot. Luckily, the important things never change. The power of love, the power of caring for people, the qualities of compassion, the humility to admit, I don't know it all, I have to seek and find. This is why they're unchanging. And this is why...
I would totally agree, entirely. And I want to get more into the Gnostic side of this as well after the next break, which is coming up. And I also want to touch on things like the Grail, because you write an awful lot about the Grail. So, you know, it's something that I've written on too, so I'm fascinated about the Grail. So after the break, we're going to get into the Grail and some more Gnostic wisdom with Tim Wallace-Murphy. Hello and welcome back to Gardener's World. Before the break, we were talking to my wonderful guest today, Tim Wallace-Murphy, about a thing called Gnosis, the mystical experience, and the fact that these things have seemed to be a golden thread through time, right back into Egypt even. So, Tim, could you explain to people really what this Gnosis is, this Gnostic experience?
Gnosis is usually defined as a form of sacred knowledge. I prefer to modify that a little. It is the product of a spiritual path, a quest for understanding, a quest to serve, a quest to get closer to the divine that is within us all. You cannot separate out Gnosis, spirituality, and the Grail quest, for example. They are all descriptions of exactly the same process. And the trouble with it is that people think they know what the Grail quest is all about. They think they know what spirituality is. And they only know a surface meaning which has been fed to them by the church to keep them quiet. I had a friend who some years ago started to recover from a serious illness as a result of following a spiritual path. And he was a bit of an agnostic, and he had problems about this. And he went to his teacher and said, I'm a lapsed Baptist. I don't want to know about religion and hypocrisy and taking the Bible down on Sunday and screwing everybody from Monday to Saturday. What's the difference between spirituality and religion? Yeah. And his teacher refused to answer him and said, you want to go and ask an expert? Back to that dreadful word again. And he recommended one, a Jesuit priest called Ed Darling. And much to this man's intense horror, he found himself in front of not merely a Catholic priest, but a Jesuit priest. And he said, Father, what's the difference between religion and spirituality? And the priest looked at him with a compassion and pity all sort of mixed up together and said, well, son, to explain this, I've got to tell you a little story, you see. Spirituality is the fresh spring water of God's love for all of creation, which arises naturally near the top of the mountain, and under God's wonderful gift of gravity trickles down the mountainside and sustains and refreshes and strengthens everything it touches. Now, religion, that's something else entirely. That's the well-intentioned man-made plumbing, which tries to make the water go uphill where it shouldn't go, and will usually whistle it past your arse without the benefit of a tap. And being man-made, of course, it always pollutes the water. If you've any doubts, my son, go back to the spring. Now, this is what every heretic, every true spiritual seeker has been doing for years. A Muslim friend of mine, a Sufi master, defined spirituality somewhat differently. He said spirituality is a river that descended to earth through Adam, may God grant him peace. It was refreshed by the great prophets Abraham, Moses, Elisha, and Jesus, may God grant them peace. By the great prophet Muhammad, may his name be blessed, and may God grant him peace. It is a river that knows no boundaries in space or culture or time. But yet sadly, but understandably, every race, every creed, every culture claims it for its own. But my friends, it is always the same river. And the nature of the spiritual experience is to bathe in that river and learn to access that interior way of knowing, that new way of thinking, that we all possess as part of our inherent birthright. That is the whole point of the Grail search. The church in the medieval days said that outside the church there is no salvation. You must come to God through us. And even if you live the life of a plaster saint, because of the taint of original sin, you're going to fry in hellfire for all eternity. And they try to equate that weird concept with the idea of a loving God. I can't square that circle. Other people can, I can't. But that meant you had to go to church. You had to do it their way. Spirituality is about following the advice of Jesus the Nazarene. Do not pray out loud in the synagogue like a hypocrite. Go to a quiet room and close the door and talk to your Heavenly Father. And talking to your Heavenly Father in the appropriate way, with humility and dedication and love, you start to get the answers, surprise, surprise. Prayer and meditation. Prayer is the asking, meditation is the listening, the receiving the knowledge, the receiving the instruction, the receiving the guidance. And if you have any doubts about the validity of this, question me by all means, but go back to the source. Did he not say, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you? Joe Campbell defined the Grail search as a quest for spiritual enlightenment. He said, why should any medieval knight go out and seek a relic, however holy, when all he has to do is go to church and through the miracle of transubstantiation partake directly of the blood and body of Christ? It's a search for enlightenment. My first collaborator, Trevor Ravenscroft, wrote perhaps his most important book, The Cup of Destiny, which is an explanation of the coded guide within Wolfram von Exenbach's Parsifal to the pathway of initiation. It's all about that. And if you look at, for example, the recorded sayings of the Native American people of the 19th century, and you look at the writings of the medieval Christian mystics, you can swap the names around. They're saying the same thing. They're using different phrases.
Absolutely.
But they've the same insights.
Because it's human.
More important, they're accessing the same divine source.
Absolutely.
And that source is within us all.
Yeah.
And it's accessible.
Yeah.
And the name of the game is to search for that. And more people are engaged on this search. In the last 30 or 40 years, what has been a trickle of interest is turning into a tidal wave of curiosity. And it transcends cultural barriers. It's got nothing to do with race or creed.
As it has for a long time.
Yes. Yeah. And it's the same search. And it's not surprising people come to the same answers.
Well, one thing that a lot of people in the world will think and will want to say, you know, in the literal world rather than this mystical world, will want to say, if this teaching has been alive for so long and has been passed on through the Rex Deus family, into the Templars and to the Freemasons, etc., why are the Freemasons therefore implicated in, unfortunately, so many revolutions and other underhand dealings, people being, you know, hung from bridges and all kinds of different things? Is this just a human element of the Freemasons?
Well, first of all, you mentioned being hung from bridges. You're obviously thinking of Roberto Calvi, who was ritually killed in London. He was murdered. And he was murdered by people who purported to be Freemasons. In fact, they weren't Freemasons at all.
And they're connected to P2, is it?
P2, it was an illicit lodge which was recognised by no Grand Lodge within Italy.
Ah, right.
And it was a front for a combination of mafia financiers and Vatican bankers. And
so
the Pope who wanted
the
Pope who wanted to investigate that matter in depth died very suddenly and very mysteriously, and some claim he was murdered. And that investigation was a renegade Irishman known as Archbishop Marcinkus, who could possibly have a lot to offer in the way of explanations. But to claim that was part of Freemasonry is not true. However, Freemasonry, the role of leading Freemasons within revolutionary movements and liberation movements is a matter of record, of which I, for one, am for whatever one may think of modern American politics, their constitution is still a beacon of light for many people who are struggling to attain basic freedoms. And that constitution was very largely formed, not completely, but very largely formed by Freemasons. One of the many reasons the papacy is still anti-Freemasonry is the unification of Italy was brought about by Garibaldi, who was, of course, a leading Freemasonry, and Pius IX knew who to blame for his enforced exile in the Vatican, the truncated state of the Vatican. It was the Freemasons who'd put him there. Prior to that, he had exerted a considerable degree of earthly power.
Very similar things can be found in Spain, Portugal.
Yes, Spain, Portugal, most of the South American countries were liberated. Bolivar, for example.
See, liberated being a different word to probably what a lot of conspiracy theorists would use.
Well, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist.
Absolutely.
It depends on which side of the property fence you're sitting. Because let's get real. It's not about abstract theories. One of the reasons that sacred teaching has been ignored so long is people have been inculcated with the idea of ownership, the idea that capitalism is somehow essentially good, and that it is perfectly okay to exploit other people, and that somehow you can reconcile that with the concept of love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, some people can do this. I can't.
No, me neither.
I've tried. Sorry, I can't do it.
You can see why some people would sort of take a step back and say, well, you know, this looks like the Freemasons have got a grand plan.
They have a grand plan. It's a very simple one. It's the same grand plan, dare I say it, that Jesus has used, that the Mevlana, Jalaluddin Rumi used, which is to teach people how to live in harmony and love and brotherhood, not merely within the group of Sufis or Freemasons, but spread that through the communities in which you serve. What you do not hear about Freemasonry are the countless billions of dollars spent annually, quietly, on charities, on medical research, on homes for handicapped children, on homes for the elderly, on providing life, because it is not about saying, what a good guy I am. No. It's about serving my community.
Absolutely. So they're following the proper service that we're talking about.
They are.
But why the other stuff secret? Is that because of the massive power base of the Catholic Church, for instance?
In the beginning, it may have been.
So is there a kind of war? Has there been a kind of war going off between the Gnostic? We were talking earlier off camera about the Celtic Church, for instance, who was certainly influenced heavily by this whole thing. Has there been a battle between this Gnostic and the Catholic Church for a long time?
The battle has always been fought from the Church's perspective. The secret teaching always tells you to appear to conform and just keep the teaching alive. You don't fight.
About the assassins,
you reflect with love. You don't go into battle. You bide your time and you wait. And that time is now coming. I remember having an interview with a very leading French mystic about 8 years ago, a wonderful man called Frédéric Lionel. And Frédéric, when we concluded the interview, which went for about 4 or 5 hours, I thanked him very profoundly. He was a wonderful man, God bless him. And he said, I've read your works. You're writing about things that are known to very few. And as a master, you have a sacred duty. You must continue. And the more I protested and said I was just a geriatric pupil, the more he just shook his head. He said, there is not much time. You must continue. And things are gathering pace. I'm about as important as a grain of sand on a beach, because there are hundreds of more people doing exactly what I'm doing. They're writing and talking about what fascinates them. It says it all on this ring. A quotation from the Holy Quran. It says, isn't God enough for you? What do I need ritual for? What do I need, apart from sharpening myself up a little bit, what do I need ritual for?
God is all.
God is all. And it's my relationship with God and finding God within myself that is the key to the whole thing. I'm a member of a 12-step recovery program, which teaches me that I can learn to tap into a deep inner resource that I have previously denied myself. What they're talking about there is spiritual transformation. It's the key to everything. It's what Jesus summed up when he said, you know, somebody asked him once, he said, what do I do? Master, what do I do to be saved? He said, honour the Lord thy God with all thy heart and all thy might, and love thy neighbour as thyself. Therein hangeth all the law and the prophets. It was not original. It was not something new. He was quoting a book that was 600 years old at the time he spoke. It's called the Book of Leviticus. It's part of standard Judaism. The whole idea of the Torah is, how do I relate to the people about me? Be they my wife, my children, my servants, my masters, my slaves. It's regulating how do I behave. And ultimately, that is the real fruit of spirituality. How do I behave towards other people?
This kind of answers a big question, really, doesn't it? What were they fighting for? What were the Rex Deus? It wasn't just about keeping it within the family. It was keeping probably, you know, one of the greatest treasures that there is. And it's been absolutely fantastic having you on. Tim, thank you so much for coming along.
Bless you, it's been a pleasure.
If anybody wants to know more about what Tim has written on, then there are lots of books. There is Roslyn, there is this brand new, the Freemasons book, The Knights of the Holy Grail.